Some doors don't stay closed forever, especially the ones built on disrespect. On the 32nd floor of the Grand Arcadia Hotel, the private dining room glowed like a world made for people who never had to ask the price of anything. Soft gold light spilled over white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and polished marble, so smooth it reflected the chandeliers like still water. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil, butter, and expensive perfume, and every sound seemed carefully trained. The low murmur of old money, the quiet click of silver against china, the muted glide of leather shoes across stone. Naomi Carter stepped out of the elevator with one hand resting just beneath the curve of her stomach, feeling the familiar weight of 7 months of pregnancy and the dull ache in her lower back after a long afternoon of appointments downtown. She wore a simple navy maternity dress, a light cream cardigan, and comfortable flats that had carried her through too many waiting rooms that day. And in her purse, tucked beside her phone and keys, was a folded black and white ultrasound print she had looked at 3 times in the car because seeing that tiny face made everything else in the world feel smaller. She paused just inside the dining entrance, taking a slow breath, not because she felt out of place, but because the baby had shifted and pressed gently upward, the way it always did when she stood too long. She was waiting for her husband, who had texted that he was finishing a meeting upstairs and wanted her to sit down, order dessert, and stay off her feet for once. And for a moment she smiled to herself, imagining the look on his face when he saw she had ignored half his instructions and come anyway. Then a voice cut across the room, sharp enough to turn heads without ever rising. "Ma'am, this floor is for registered guests and private members." Naomi looked up and saw the waiter approaching with a silver water carafe in one hand and a thin, practiced expression on his face, the kind that tried to pass for professionalism while carrying something much colder underneath. His name tag read Ethan. He gave her one quick glance, then another, slower one, taking in her dress, her shoes, her pregnancy, the fact that she had arrived alone, and somewhere in that silent inventory he seemed to decide exactly who he thought she was. Naomi answered in the calm voice of someone who had spent years learning how not to react too quickly when strangers confused dignity for weakness. "I'm meeting my husband." Ethan's mouth barely moved. "Then you can wait downstairs." A couple near the windows looked over, then looked away. Naomi kept her posture straight. "He asked me to meet him here." Ethan's smile did not warm. "This space isn't for people wandering in off the street." The words landed harder than his tone. Naomi felt it, not like a wound, but like something old and familiar brushing against her skin again. That ugly certainty some people carried when they believed luxury gave them permission to decide who belonged inside it. She opened her mouth to answer, but Ethan moved first. With one careless flick of his wrist, a splash of cold water slipped from the lip of the carafe and spread across the front of her cardigan and dress, darkening the fabric in a sudden stain that shimmered under the chandelier light. The room seemed to inhale. Naomi froze, not from the water itself, but from the quiet that followed, the kind of silence that told you everyone had seen it, and no one yet knew whether they were brave enough to call it what it was. Naomi did not move right away. Cold water clung to the front of her dress and cardigan, then slid downward in thin, shining trails that gathered at the hem before falling to the marble in slow, measured drops. She could feel the chill against her skin, but what settled deeper was the weight of being watched, that old, exhausting feeling of standing in a room full of people and realizing your humiliation had become a form of entertainment for strangers who preferred comfort over courage. Still, she kept one hand on the curve of her stomach and the other at her side, fingers steady, shoulders level, chin lifted just enough to remind herself who she was before anyone else had the chance to define her. Naomi Carter had spent most of her life learning how to remain whole in places that invited her in only after deciding she did not belong. She was 32 years old, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, the daughter of a city bus driver and a public school librarian who taught her that dignity was not something other people handed you. It was something you carried, especially on the days when the world tried to make you set it down. As a little girl, she had watched her mother smooth out library book covers with patient hands and speak softly to children no one else noticed. And she had learned early that kindness was not the same thing as surrender. Kindness was discipline. It was memory. It was refusing to let bitterness write your character for you. Naomi had taken that lesson into every chapter of her life. Through college classes she paid for with scholarships and weekend shifts. Through the nonprofit work she later chose over a higher salary because she believed mothers in underserved neighborhoods deserved better prenatal care. Through every meeting where people assumed she was younger, less informed, or less capable than she actually was. And now, 7 months pregnant, she moved through the world with a tenderness sharpened by responsibility, because every choice she made no longer belonged to her alone. That afternoon had started before sunrise with a routine appointment on the other side of the city, then lab work, then a long wait in a specialist office where the air conditioning worked too hard and the magazines were 6 months old. By the time she reached the hotel, her feet ached, her back was tight, and all she really wanted was 10 quiet minutes, a glass of ice water she could actually drink, and the reassuring sight of her husband walking toward her with that half-apologetic smile he always wore when business ran longer than promised. In her purse, folded carefully between a packet of crackers and her appointment papers, was the newest ultrasound image, the one she planned to show him over dessert even though he had already seen the digital copy. She liked the printed one better. It felt real in her hand, like proof that hope could take shape, grainy and small, and already loved. So when she finally lifted her eyes from the spill darkening her dress, there was no anger in them at first. There was fatigue, yes, and disbelief, and beneath both of those something stronger than either one. Ethan had looked at her and seen inconvenience. He had looked at her and seen someone easy to dismiss. But Naomi knew the truth of herself with the kind of certainty that cannot be shaken loose by a rude voice, an expensive room, or a room full of people too timid to interrupt injustice. She was not there by accident. She was not lost. She was not less than anyone seated beneath those chandeliers. And even with cold water on her clothes and silence pressing in from every side, she stood there carrying far more grace than the room had earned. Ethan Whitmore had worked long enough under the chandeliers of the Grand Arcadia to mistake proximity for importance. At 29, he moved through the private dining floor with the polished confidence of a man who had memorized every wine label on the reserve list, every surname that mattered to investors, and every unspoken rule that kept luxury running on time. He knew which guests wanted sparkling water from Italy, which executives expected a corner table without asking, which regulars tipped in folded hundreds, and which ones only performed generosity when someone was watching. Over the years, the hotel had trained his posture, sharpened his smile, and taught him how to make service look effortless, but it had also fed something smaller and meaner in him, a belief that elegance was a kind of inheritance and that some people walked into wealth as if they belonged while others only brushed against it from the outside. Ethan liked the order of that world because it made him feel secure inside his own role. He was not rich, not truly, but on this floor he borrowed the authority of marble, crystal, and silence. Here, with a pressed white jacket, a silver carafe, and the approval of guests who never learned his last name, he could pretend he was closer to power than the people he judged. He told himself he was protecting standards, maintaining atmosphere, preserving the brand, all the expensive phrases that allowed cruelty to dress itself in professional language. The truth was simpler. He had grown comfortable confusing appearance with worth. Naomi's presence had unsettled him the moment the elevator doors opened, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she did not fit the story he had already written in his head. In Ethan's mind, a woman arriving alone, visibly pregnant, wearing practical flats and a cardigan instead of designer labels, did not belong on the private floor minutes before a high-level corporate dinner. He had not asked who she was because asking would have required humility. He had judged first because judgment was faster, and in rooms like this, speed often passed for competence. Across the dining room, a few guests lowered their eyes into their glasses, unwilling to involve themselves. Others watched with the detached curiosity of people who treated discomfort like part of the evening's theater. Near the host's stand, Marlene Hayes, the floor manager for the evening shift, had turned at the sound of the carafe and now stood perfectly still, one hand holding a tablet to her chest. Marlene had the sharp suit, composed expression, and managerial instincts of someone who could read a room in seconds. But what she read now was not just the scene in front of her. It was risk, reputation, timing, and whether intervening would calm the floor or complicate it. Ethan sensed that hesitation and mistook it for support. The corners of his mouth pulled into something that almost resembled satisfaction. He set the carafe down on a side station with deliberate care, as if he had merely corrected an inconvenience, and the dry precision of that gesture made the insult feel even colder. Naomi looked at him with a steadiness he had not expected, and for the first time a faint uncertainty moved through him, brief as a draft under a closed door. But pride covered it quickly. In Ethan's world, people like Naomi were supposed to shrink, apologize, retreat, and spare everyone the discomfort of acknowledging what had just happened. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, water on her dress, hand on her child, dignity intact, and that quiet refusal began to shift the balance of the room in a way he did not yet understand. Naomi let the silence settle before she spoke, and when her voice finally came, it did not shake. It moved through the room with a calm that was somehow more arresting than outrage. "You did not make a mistake," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "You made a choice." The sentence landed with the clean force of truth, and for a moment, even the soft clinking of silverware from the far end of the dining floor seemed to disappear. Ethan gave a short laugh that sounded rehearsed, the kind of laugh people use when they want to make someone else appear unreasonable. "Ma'am, if you are finished causing a disruption, I can have someone escort you downstairs." Naomi did not blink. A drop of water slipped from the edge of her cardigan cuff and struck the marble near her shoe. "I am not the disruption," she said. "Your behavior is." Marlene shifted near the host's stand, as if those words had finally reached the place where policy and conscience begin to argue with each other. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the manager without taking her hand from the curve of her stomach. "I would like to speak with the person in charge of this floor." Marlene hesitated only half a second before stepping forward, the tablet still held against her ribs like a shield she was no longer sure how to use. "I am the floor manager," she said, voice low and controlled. "Perhaps we can discuss this privately." Naomi met her eyes and answered with a dignity that made private feel too small for what had happened. "No," she said. "What he did was public." A murmur passed through the nearest tables, subtle but undeniable, the sound of discomfort moving from one expensive chair to the next. One man loosened his jaw and looked away. A woman near the windows set her glass down more carefully than before. Naomi could feel the room resisting her, not because she was wrong, but because truth spoken aloud has a way of stripping elegance off people who depend on silence to keep things polished. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself against the mild, tightening low in her back, then continued. "I came here to meet my husband. I was spoken to with disrespect, judged before I said 10 words, and then humiliated in front of this entire room. I am standing here 7 months pregnant, soaked because your employee decided that how I looked mattered more than who I am." Ethan's expression hardened, but there was uncertainty in it now, a small crack beneath the surface confidence. "You are overreacting," he said. "This is a misunderstanding." Naomi turned back to him, and there was no anger in her face now, only clarity. "No," she said quietly. "A misunderstanding happens when someone does not know better. This happened because you thought you had the right." The words settled over him like a light that gave him nowhere to hide. Marlene opened her mouth as if to smooth it over, to pull the moment back into the safe language of guest relations and unfortunate incidents. But Naomi did not allow the truth to be repackaged. "Do not apologize for the spill," she said. "Address the assumption behind it." For the first time since the water had touched her clothes, the room seemed to understand that this woman was not going to disappear into embarrassment. She was going to stand there, in wet fabric and sensible shoes, carrying her child and her self-respect at the same time, and force everyone within earshot to decide what kind of people they were going to be. The room did not recover after Naomi spoke. It only grew tighter, as if every breath inside that private dining floor had become more expensive. Ethan's face changed in small ways first, the lift of his chin, the set of his mouth, the faint color rising along his collar as he realized the attention of the room was no longer protecting him. It was measuring him. Yet pride still held him upright. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, each word clipped and careful, as though a polished tone could erase what everyone had already seen. "This is a private floor. I was doing my job. Naomi looked at him with a stillness that made his explanation sound thinner the moment it left his mouth. "Your job is service," she said, "not judgment." A hush passed through the nearby tables. Someone farther back shifted in a chair. Another guest, a man with silver at his temples, lowered his phone just enough to suggest he had been recording longer than anyone knew. Marlene noticed it too. Naomi saw her eyes flick toward the device, then toward Ethan, then back to the guest whose silence had begun to feel less neutral and more dangerous. "Let us take care of this immediately," Marlene said, stepping into the widening tension with the professional tone of someone trying to regain control before the evening slipped beyond repair. "Ma'am, we can offer dry cleaning, a fresh garment from our boutique, and a complimentary." "No," Naomi said, not loudly, but firmly enough to stop the sentence in midair. "You do not fix this with fabric." Her hand remained at the base of her stomach. The baby shifted again, small and real, and she let herself breathe through the tightness in her lower back without showing more than a blink. Ethan saw the motion and, instead of softening, made the worst choice he had made all evening. "This is exactly the problem," he said, with a glance toward the surrounding tables, as if appealing to some invisible jury of wealth and etiquette. "People come into places like this looking for a scene, looking for compensation, looking for someone to blame because they cannot handle being told where they do and do not belong." The cruelty of it did not come from volume. It came from familiarity. He spoke as if he had said versions of that sentence before, to himself if not out loud, and believed every part of it. Naomi felt the words strike the room before they reached her, because this time even those who had chosen silence a moment ago could not pretend they had misread what was happening. Marlene's expression hardened, just slightly, but not enough to erase the fact that she had waited too long. "Ethan," she said in a lower voice, "that is enough." He turned toward her, startled less by the correction than by the fact that it had finally arrived. "I am trying to protect this floor," he said. "From what?" Naomi asked. The question was calm, but it opened something sharp in the middle of the room. "From a pregnant woman waiting for her husband?" Ethan did not answer. Naomi did not need him to. She looked past him, toward the guests, toward the polished glasses and folded napkins and chandeliers throwing warm light over a moment that had gone cold beyond repair. "Some of you saw what happened," she said. "Some of you heard every word. And not one of you thought dignity was worth interrupting dinner." No one spoke. No one could. The accusation was too clean, too deserved. Even the music drifting from hidden speakers seemed to fall back from itself. Naomi could feel the ache in her feet, the damp fabric cooling against her skin, the pulse at the base of her throat. But beneath all of it was something steadier than anger. She was not going to shrink for Ethan. She was not going to rescue the room from the truth of what it had allowed. And as the silence deepened around her, heavy as storm air before rain, the distant bell of the private elevator sounded from the far end of the corridor, soft but unmistakable, and every head in the room turned toward it at once. The sound from the private elevator was not loud, but in the silence that followed Naomi's words, it seemed to travel through the entire floor like a line drawn across glass. No one moved at first. The dining room, so polished just minutes earlier, now felt suspended inside a strange stillness, as if the air itself had paused to see what would happen next. Warm chandelier light lay across the marble in long reflections, catching the scattered drops of water near Naomi's shoes and turning them into small points of brightness against the stone. She lowered her eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in concentration, letting one slow breath fill her chest, and then leave it just as carefully. Her cardigan clung cool against her skin. The damp fabric at her waist felt heavier now, and beneath her palm the baby shifted again, a gentle reminder of the life she was carrying through a room that had offered her neither comfort nor grace. Naomi pressed her hand there a little more firmly, steadying herself with that simple contact. She had learned long ago that some moments do not ask for noise. They ask for presence. Around her, the room held its shape but lost its certainty. The guests who had looked away now seemed unsure where to place their eyes. A woman near the far window stared into her untouched glass of white wine as though answers might be waiting there. The man with the silver temples kept his phone lowered but not hidden. His expression changed from curiosity to something closer to shame. Marlene stood with her shoulders tight, tablet angled against her side, No longer the manager of a flawless evening, but a woman realizing that delay had its own moral cost. Ethan, however, remained beside the service station with one hand near the folded linen napkins, his posture rigid in the way people stand when they sense the room slipping out from under them but refuse to admit it. Yet the confidence that had carried him only minutes earlier had thinned. It was there in the way his jaw tightened too often, in the way his eyes flicked toward the elevator and then away, as if some part of him suddenly understood that what was coming might not be manageable with a smooth explanation and a polished smile. Naomi lifted her face again and looked toward the far end of the corridor where the elevator doors remained closed for one long second, then another. In that pause, the quiet took on texture. There was the faint hum of hidden ventilation, the distant muted clatter from a kitchen beyond the dining room, the soft rustle of someone adjusting in an upholstered chair, the nearly invisible patter of one last drop falling from Naomi's hem to the marble below. The whole floor seemed to breathe around that sound. Her heart was beating faster now, but not from fear alone. She knew Adrian was close. She could feel it in the timing of the evening, in the unfinished text message he had sent, in the instinct that had made her come upstairs instead of waiting in the lobby. But even before he appeared, something essential had already changed. The room had seen who Ethan was when he believed no one important was watching. It had seen who Naomi was when everyone was. And there, beneath the gold light and the hush of expensive discomfort, she stood with wet clothes, aching feet, and unbroken dignity, while the private elevator doors finally began to slide open. The elevator doors opened without hurry, polished steel parting on a scene no one in the room was prepared to receive. Adrian Carter stepped out first, tall, composed, and dressed in the kind of tailored charcoal suit that did not ask for attention because it had never needed to. Two members of the executive team followed behind him, along with a gray-haired attorney Naomi recognized from one of Adrian's recent calls at home, the one he had taken in his study with the door half closed and a legal pad full of numbers. Adrian had the focused look of a man coming out of a final negotiation, but the expression vanished the instant his eyes found Naomi. He stopped so suddenly that the others behind him checked their pace. For one suspended second, he seemed unable to connect the room before him with what he was seeing. His wife standing motionless under warm chandelier light, one hand over their child, her dress darkened with water, a hush spread around her like a wound no one wanted named. Then his face changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. The practiced calm of business disappeared, and something deeper took its place, something protective and stunned, and quietly furious in a way that did not need volume to make itself felt. "Naomi," he said, crossing the marble floor toward her. It was the first truly human sound the room had heard in minutes. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time that evening, some of the strain in her shoulders eased. Adrian reached her and took in the wet cardigan, the damp fabric at her waist, the silence of the guests, the rigid posture of the waiter, the frozen indecision of management. His eyes moved once across the room, sharp and controlled, then returned to Naomi's face. "Are you all right?" he asked. Naomi gave the smallest nod, though her eyes told him enough to turn his expression even colder. Marlene stepped forward immediately, finding her voice a half-second too late to sound innocent. "Mr. Carter, I can explain." Ethan stared as if the floor beneath him had shifted into something unstable. He looked from Adrian to Naomi and back again, trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed with the man now standing beside her, one arm already around her shoulders with the instinctive care of a husband who did not need introductions. The attorney behind Adrian said nothing, but his gaze had narrowed in the particular way of men whose work begins where excuses end. One of the executives, a woman in a black suit with a brass hotel insignia at her lapel, looked toward Marlene with open disbelief. Ethan swallowed. The color had drained from his face. "Mr. Carter," he said, as if the name itself might somehow rearrange reality into something survivable. Adrian turned toward him fully then, and the whole room seemed to straighten under the force of that attention. "You know who I am," Adrian said, his voice low and even. It was not a question. No one in that flagship property could mistake him now, not after the private meetings all day, not after the signed acquisition papers that had changed ownership of the entire hotel group less than an hour earlier. By that morning, he had still been a buyer. By tonight, he was the new owner of every property under the Arcadia Collection name, from Chicago to Miami to Napa to Manhattan. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed again. Across the room, the man with the silver temples lifted his phone slightly and said, into the silence, "I recorded the whole thing." The sentence struck like a second revelation. Marlene closed her eyes for the briefest instant. The executive in black extended her hand, and the guest crossed the room to place the phone in it. On the screen, reflected in cold, digital clarity, was everything Ethan had hoped would dissolve into polite confusion. Naomi entering alone, his expression changing, the careless tilt of the silver carafe, the water spreading across her dress, the smug certainty that followed. No one had to argue any more about what happened. The room had witnessed it once, and the video was prepared to witness it forever. For a moment, no one spoke. The truth was already standing in the room in more than one form now. In the water still drying on Naomi's dress, in the video glowing on the executive's phone, and in the stunned face of the waiter who had mistaken borrowed status for real power. Ethan took one step forward, then stopped himself, as if even movement had become dangerous. "Mr. Carter, I did not realize," he said, his voice suddenly stripped of the smooth confidence he had worn all evening. "I would never have acted that way if I had known who she was." The words hung in the air with the sourness of a confession that only made the failure worse. Naomi felt Adrian's arm around her shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly, not in restraint, but in recognition. He had heard it too. Not remorse for what had been done, but regret over whom it had been done to. Adrian's jaw set, and when he answered, his voice was controlled enough to cut. "That is exactly the problem." Ethan lowered his eyes. Marlene stood rigid, her face pale beneath the warm dining room light, while the executive in black suit held the phone at her side like a sealed record of the hotel's moral collapse. "Mr. Carter," Marlene said carefully, "we are prepared to suspend him immediately, file a full incident report, and issue a formal apology." Adrian looked at her, then at Ethan, then back to Naomi. The room expected anger from him. It expected a swift decision, a hard sentence, a display of ownership that would reassure everyone that consequences existed only when power entered the room. But Naomi, still damp from the insult and tired from the long day pressing against her lower back, understood something the rest of them did not. If this moment became only about punishing one man, then the deeper sickness would walk away in a clean suit and call itself resolved. She gently touched Adrian's wrist, and the gesture alone was enough to redirect the center of the room. "No one gets to hide behind procedure tonight," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried farther than any raised tone could have. Ethan looked up. Marlene did too. Even the guests who had tried to disappear into their seats seemed to lean into her words without meaning to. "Yes, there should be consequences," Naomi said. "But not because my husband owns this hotel. Not because there is a video. And not because this room suddenly decided to care when someone powerful walked in." She let the silence hold that truth for a second before continuing. "There should be consequences because what happened here was wrong when I was standing here alone." The attorney near the elevator lowered his gaze, almost respectfully. Adrian said nothing. He did not need to. Naomi stepped slightly forward, though Adrian stayed close enough to steady her if needed. "I want the report filed," she said. "I want the video preserved. I want every employee on this property, and every property in this company, trained to understand that hospitality without humanity is failure in a nicer uniform. I want your staff taught that class is not measured by a watch, a dress, or who walks in beside you. And I want the truth written exactly as it happened." Ethan's face had collapsed into something smaller now, stripped of arrogance and left with the bare outline of a man confronting himself for the first time. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "I am sorry." Naomi looked at him, and her expression did not harden. That was what made it unbearable. "Be sorry enough to change," she said. "Not just enough to keep your job." No one in the room would forget that sentence. Marlene nodded once, the movement tight with shame. The executive in black suit turned to the attorney and said they would begin a full review that night. Adrian reached up and removed his suit jacket, then draped it carefully over Naomi's shoulders, covering the damp fabric with quiet tenderness. Under the chandeliers, with witnesses all around them, and the whole polished room suddenly reduced to honesty, Naomi had done what power alone never could. She had taken humiliation and turned it into accountability, not with revenge, but with a standard no one there could pretend not to understand. When Naomi finally turned toward the elevator again, the room seemed smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier, as if truth had reduced all that polished grandeur to what it really was. A beautiful place made fragile by the character of the people inside it. Adrian stayed beside her, one hand warm at the middle of her back, guiding without hurrying, and his jacket rested over her shoulders with the clean scent of cedar and starch and a trace of the cologne she knew better than any luxury in that room. The marble beneath her flats still reflected the chandeliers in long gold streaks, but now it also held the fading marks of water where she had stood her ground. Naomi glanced down as she walked and saw those small dark traces drying behind her, already disappearing into the stone, and something about that felt honest. Some stains lasted. Some only revealed what had been there all along. No one tried to stop them. No one offered another rushed apology or another polished sentence designed to make the evening feel salvageable. Marlene had stepped aside, her tablet lowered. Her expression changed into the sober look of a person who understood that a job title could not protect anyone from moral failure. The executive team remained near the private dining entrance, speaking in low voices with the attorney, but even they seemed careful now, as if the room required a different language than the one used for acquisitions and strategy. Ethan stood exactly where Naomi had left him, near the side station with its folded linen and silver service, but the borrowed confidence was gone. Without it, he looked younger, smaller, and far less certain of the world he had trusted to elevate him. Naomi did not hate him. That was the part he seemed least prepared for. When they drew level with him, Adrian slowed, and the silence deepened again, not with fear this time, but with the full weight of consequence settling where denial used to be. Ethan lifted his eyes once, shame and disbelief still written plainly across his face. Naomi met his gaze for a brief, steady second. There was no triumph in her expression, no performance, no cruelty returned for cruelty given. She only let him see her clearly now, not as a silhouette he could misjudge from a doorway, not as a stranger he could reduce to a category, but as a woman who had every reason to break the moment open with anger and had chosen something harder instead. Kindness would have cost you nothing, she said softly. Remember that for the rest of your life. Then she kept walking. The words were not loud, but they followed her across the marble more powerfully than anything else spoken that night. Adrian pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, he helped her inside with the same quiet care he had shown from the moment he saw her standing there. The doors began to close on the golden dining room, the white tablecloths, the lowered eyes, the witnesses, the manager, the waiter, the entire carefully arranged world that had failed a simple test of decency until decency stood in front of it and refused to bend. As the elevator descended, Naomi let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized. Adrian slipped an arm around her shoulders and kissed the top of her head. She leaned into him, one hand over the jacket at her chest, and the other returning to the gentle curve of her stomach. Below them, the city stretched into evening, its streetlights flickering on one by one like small mercies in the dark. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The baby moved once, softly, and Naomi smiled through tired eyes. In that quiet steel box moving down through 32 floors of glass and money and consequence, justice did not sound like celebration. It sounded like breath returning. It sounded like 2 steady heartbeats and the promise of a third. And somewhere above them, in a dining room still bright with chandeliers, the silence they left behind would speak longer than any apology ever could. Full form expand.